So after these moments of increasing excitement, welcome to this inaugural lecture and seminar with the new Zennström Professor, Stacy VanDeveer. We will arrange this in three different components in this session. First, we will have a word of welcome from Platzer-Björkman, who is Vice-rector at the university. Then Stacy will give his presentation, and that will be followed by a panel discussion when we will also invite you to ask questions or comments. Okay, so we're good to go. Let's welcome Charlotte with the floor.
Thank you, and I'm very happy, of course, to stand here and to be able to welcome Professor Stacy VanDeveer, and equally happy that we have this Zennström donation, of course, that makes it possible for us to have our sixth in a row Zennström Professor. So we're very happy for that. So I'll be quite brief, but I'll say a few words about what Uppsala is doing in terms of climate research and how I think also the Zennström Professorship can contribute to this. So without being able to mention everything, I mean, we have research and education on climate models, environmental law, fossil-free energy, biodiversity, ecosystem science, water resources, urban planning, peace and conflict, education for sustainable development, student-driven education, and much, much more. But given all that we know, why are climate policies so difficult to implement? And I think this is a very important and timely piece of the puzzle, where we do have climate leadership research in Uppsala, but where you will come in and complement, and I think that's super important. Today, we do not only welcome Professor VanDeveer, we also celebrate the university's birthday, 546 years since the first university teaching started in October 1477. Sometimes this long history is seen as a burden, but to me, I think this also gives something to hold on to in turbulent times and with large challenges facing us. So we know that there's been large challenges in history too during this time, but the fact that the university remains says something about the power of the institution, the power of knowledge, of the drive to understand nature, humans, and society, and the power of gathering people around this knowledge. So the way I'm thinking, the aim must be that students and staff that celebrate the university's 600th birthday in 2077 will look back at important contributions to gaining and spreading knowledge that played a positive role in one of the largest transitions in human history. And this transition is the one away from fossil fuels, degradation of biosphere, into human society's imbalance with the planet. So my background is in energy research, and I'm currently amazed to see the change that's now happening in this sector. And I spoke to you a bit before about some of the companies I've met making huge investments into the energy and transport sector, etc. But even if this is inspiring, the need for even faster change globally and the pressure that this puts on both politics and societies is very hard to grasp and to tackle. So what we can do in our role at the university is to build on the academic tradition of exploring, questioning, discussing openly like this, and try to make use of the different expertise and perspectives available. So I think exactly this is what the Zennström Professorship can do, and it's an excellent injection to us here at Uppsala in this respect. And with you here, Stacy, we look forward to new insights and inspiration. So most welcome.
So, Stacy, please tell us who you are, what you're doing, what your plans are, and how you reflect on all these issues linked to climate change leadership, and and the world and society. You're most welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now let's the moment of truth. Does the slide advance? It does. Very exciting. It is really great to be here. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for hosting me. Thank you to Uppsala University and to Ian Snowball and my colleagues in the Department of Earth Science, my new colleagues in the Department of Earth Sciences. Thanks also to Mikael Zennström for the donation. I wouldn't be here today without that. And my climate leadership team colleagues, Mikael and Judith, and the whole group. It's just been a pleasure so far. I think I've been 3 weeks or so here, so we're getting up and running. Also, thanks to my husband Mikael and my mom who are here, which is great. And I guess like Mikael Zennström, I also would not be here without mom. So it's nice to have her here. My presentation has sort of 5 parts today. And after this, sort of trying to answer this hopefully somewhat provocative question about why it is not getting easier to make climate policy and why many days or in many places it gets harder after all this time. So I'll talk a little bit about my early work, a bit about me and a bit about my early work. I'm old enough that my early academic work that kind of early in this cycle is now work from the last century. So I like this sort of art history kind of reference. And then I'll talk a little bit about leadership on climate change and policy and political leadership before we come to sort of where are we now and how do we best understand it, and drawing some lessons from some contemporary policy questions. Now, this is a little bit about me, as you see. I was a political scientist, so my work has been mostly on political institutions, policy institutions, social institutions around environmental questions and climate change. But very consistently since the time I was a graduate student until today, one of the themes that has pulled it all together is that I've been very interested in the role of scientists and scientific and technical research, and how scientists and technical experts organize themselves or get organized by others to participate in environmental politics and environmental policy making. So, so you'll see this theme sort of runs through. These are kind of a few book covers. You'll see some of it along set on seas over here, regional seas, before the climate took over all of our research agendas. Some work on global institutions and global cooperation, some work on North American and European environmental politics comparatively, and comparative environmental politics. For those of you who are not political scientists, comparative politics is one of the sort of areas or standard areas of political science research. And in essence, what we, I think the easiest way to understand it is a lot of research on how we systematically compare policies or citizenships or social institutions across countries, across cities, or across scales. And so my view is that climate change and environmental politics research has often been quite dominated, the social science research, either by people focusing on their own country or on a lot of global politics and global institutions, which can be very frustrating and slow, global politics and global institutions. But there is a lot of this space in between about how we systematically learn across borders, and so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. This one in the middle, the Oxford Handbook on Comparative Environmental Politics, has just come out. So that's my living up to our reputation as Americans. That's my shameless plug for the latest book. But awesomely, students should know, the books are, of course, ridiculously expensive, but the Oxford handbooks also are available in the online database through the library and such. So if you are interested, go and dig some out. And the climate change leadership, the climate change politics agenda has expanded substantially. I am old enough to remember when most of what we talked about almost all the time was electricity production and all the fossil fuels from that. But one of the themes of this talk and one of the explanations for why they're getting harder is precisely because of the huge expansion of climate politics and climate policy throughout our everyday lives, and that theme will continue. And then the other theme that kind of comes up here is these two books over here with a set of colleagues, European and North American, look at what we call often the resource nexus. And in this sense, I think one of the easy ways to understand this, there's some complex jargon in there that I won't foist on you. But one of the easiest ways to understand this is that demands of humans and our economic activities and our everyday lives of water and food and land and minerals and energy are interconnected. They drive one another. And so one of the themes that comes up later, right, is that our slow transition that we still need to accelerate to cleaner forms of power is driving huge increases in mining around the world, and we'll talk a little bit about that as I move forward. So enough about me, probably too much. So let's talk a little bit about politics now. For this, I'm going back to the 1990s because I think actually it helps us to think about how we understood climate politics and climate policy making when it was first in the 1980s and 1990s becoming a kind of major or concern of our time. So my own dissertation was on, at the University of Maryland, was on, not on climate change, it was on Baltic regional cooperation around to protect the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean Sea as a comparator. And the kind of question on the very international relations question that the dissertation was about was, you had this several decades old Baltic environmental cooperation arrangement. The Helsinki Commission sits at its center. All of the Cold War Baltic states were represented, but it was heavily driven by, even though it was an international sort of cooperation with the member countries of the Baltic Sea structuring it, it was mostly the everyday politics of it was mostly populated by scientists and people with scientific and technical training, Baltic marine biologists and the like. And so the question at the time was, does this regional cooperation matter? Do states, other than going to the meeting and moving the meetings around the Baltic Sea every year, what do they declare, these voluntary declarations every year? There's a list of recommendations every year that they used to approve, and they still do it. Do the member governments, do the states actually do anything? And the answer was yes, they do enact some of them. They don't enact them all. Some of them just remain sort of nice goals, but many of them get enacted. But in particular, what you saw is that there was an acceleration as the Cold War came to an end and the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland began to chart a more European course. And what we also saw, which will keep coming up, is that in those newly post-communist states, and indeed in the other states around the Baltic, the states which had the most capacity to act at home were the ones most likely to take those international promises and do something with them. So in other words, the sort of institutional strength of the Environment Ministry, the level of interest in the environment in the parliaments, all of these kinds of things mattered for whether or not these nice voluntary promises that they were making every year actually got enacted into policy. So this sort of connection between the scientific advice and the scientific and technical language, some of them are very detailed and technical about how you do things like leather tanning in a less, in a less environmentally offensive way. But you convert all of these very scientific and technical reports and detailed language into political action by connecting them to authoritative institutions in the state, mostly in the state. Now, this sets up a question of this relationship of scientific and technical advice to policymaking. My postdoc was at the Kennedy School and on what was called the Global Environmental Assessment Project. And here was where I became, somewhat to the chagrin of my fellow political scientists, I became less of a political scientist, which was probably good. And it was probably good because actually, it turns out that studying environmental policy and environmental politics was much better done on very interdisciplinary teams. So that our political science questions were very driven by a long history of the discipline, but they were not, in fact, nearly as useful in environmental policy as the interdisciplinary teams. But the interdisciplinary team adopted this language from scientific and technology studies on co-production, essentially the sort of idea that you are making knowledge among scientists and non-scientists, among policymakers and non-policymakers, among policymakers and scientists, that when you are working together to produce knowledge, it often turns out to be more useful. But it's not just a matter of utility. It is that the idea of co-production of knowledge reminds us that science is not politics free. It's not free of, social interaction, that in fact we build scientific consensus in lots of ways that we build political or democratic consensus. Am I ringing somewhere? And so this area of research of scientific and technical studies, technology studies, really began to impact our thinking about how environmental policy works. So a couple of things about this. If you think about, there's the sort of co-producing or co-making scientific and policy knowledge. You look again from the Baltic to European air pollution, to some of the ways in which the European Commission works, that you get these various kinds of panels and institutions, scientific and technical advice, policymakers, citizens. They sit on the same kinds of bodies and make knowledge together. Another way to think about this is that scientists, when they participate in this kind of work, learn a lot about how politics is actually made. And oftentimes, scientists don't really love this lesson. It turns out that scientists are often very frustrated when they learn more about how politics happens. But it is, in fact, the path toward having your science or your scientific interests more likely to have political or policy impact than if you simply do your good science, publish it well in the right places, get tenure. Those are all great things, but they don't often lead to that science being used by people in politics. The most often way to do this, and we'll see this over and over, is that you have to engage these institutions. So you're making knowledge together, you're making institutions, you're making the organizations that allow scientific and policy cooperation to happen at the same time. This was also a period in which the late 1990s and the first decade of the century, in which there was a large discourse on Europeanizing Europe, essentially, right? The sort of movement of the huge set of member states in the East to join the European Union. And this happened, of course, with all these official processes of negotiation, Poland negotiating its way into the European Union, but it happened throughout societies. So you see that environmental policy is completely remade over this decade in most of the East, and it's remade along the lines of the principles and institutions that that were already happening in the earlier member states. Scientific advice, scientific and technical conferencing, all of them were being Europeanized, if you want to sort of use the sort of jargon of the time. I guess I should say that one of the things that was getting pretty clear even then, that Europeanization around the Baltic and Europeanization of air pollution science was extending kind of to the Russian border, but not very much in to Russia. And in fact, some at the time often pointed out that St. Petersburg was sort of being Europeanized, very interested in the Baltic and Baltic cooperation, for example, but Moscow was not. So actually, I think we do live in that world that was created then, the one where the line in Europe moved east, but it didn't go away. It just moved east. And you see this in the scientific and technical cooperation, as well as in the official cooperation, or in our current era of war making. So when we go to this project, the Global Environmental Assessment Project. This is how we sort of set up, I think, some of our thinking at the time when I look back at it. First of all, critical in the Global Environmental Assessment Project was this acronym, this sort of 3 letters, CSL, for credibility, salience, and legitimacy. That what we started to talk about a lot in this literature was that scientific and technical advice for policymaking, and that indeed it didn't even have to be made for policymaking, it could be made just because people were making their scientific knowledge. If you wanted it to matter in politics, you needed it to be, in some measure, scientifically credible, needed to be good science, as the scientists often say. It needed to be made in ways that added legitimacy to it, participatory in some respects, seeable, transparent, and it needed to be salient, which is to say useful, relevant. And one of the things that's clear when you start taking all of these different scientific bodies, some of them global, some of them national, some of them even urban in scope, and you study them as social scientists, what you see here is, over and over again, is that the science does not make itself useful. Scientific articles do not make themselves useful to politicians. They're useful to the scientists, and they're useful in science, but they don't make themselves useful in politics and policymaking. Other institutions and other people often do that. The scientists themselves joining the institutions and giving advice and reinterpreting their findings, or other people do so. We have called them knowledge brokers and boundary objects and all kinds of jargon about this. But the point is that science is useful when it's part of a social process that includes decision makers and other non-scientists who need the information in order to act in accordance with science. We had a mantra over and over that I still use with students, is that these kind of assessments, they're not just reports. They're not just big giant binders that sit on somebody's shelf. They produce those, but actually those are the least relevant part of the process, those big binders, because not very many people read them. They are social processes, all of these scientific and technical institution bodies. They are the places that science is made useful. So when I look back on this, I see some of our assumptions that don't hold very true, and this is the kind of inspiration for this talk, is that I think we're pretty confident collectively. I was a young graduate student and a postdoc. The senior scholars were pretty confident of this as well, that, you know, when the science of climate change became more and more certain, when we reduced the certainty, we would get closer to real political action, right? When publics and voters understood how serious, how alarming, how terrible many of the climate impacts are going to be, they would begin to act, right? So we would need to bring certainty up and uncertainty down. We needed to bring the awareness level of policymakers and the awareness level of citizens up. Lots of projects on citizen science and awareness of climate science. Lots of projects on the media, trying to make sure the media gets climate right, all this sort of stuff to raise awareness. And surely when the impacts of climate change are sort of visible in our everyday lives, like when they're on the front page of the newspaper, which we would have said then because there were newspapers, or if they're on your news feed on your screen every single day, right? This was the recipe, right, for action. Less uncertainty, more certainty, more awareness, impacts visible. Surely citizens and policymakers will agree that we have to do something about climate change under this set of circumstances. And as you hear me set this up, I think actually, now this is behind me, but 25 years later, right, all of these things have happened. All of these assumptions that we had, they're all happened. And still we have very mediocre climate policy that remains controversial, that isn't doing enough, and that some people are rolling back anyway, right? In this country and elsewhere. So let's try to figure out what the heck is going on. Excuse me. So now I'll do a little bit of review of climate leadership, and then we'll bring the pieces together. So when we think about climate change leadership, in the social science literature, and especially in the politics and policy literature, sociology, political science, international relations, we do see that we built some pretty valuable insights about climate leaders and climate leadership. Perhaps the most consistent one is this last bullet here: leaders deploy science and technological evidence, and they deploy language and discourses that combine strategic action, like this is good for you, your self-interest is in this policy, and scientific and technical credibility, and our kind of moral language and values. So, right, we don't like waste, so we should have policies that are more efficient. And that would be good for us, and it'll create economic growth. So you get lots of these like combinations, right? That climate action is going to create jobs, make our communities nicer. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because it also helps to clean the air. That's healthy. It's the right thing to do because we live in Europe and North America, and we're using much more of the atmosphere than other people in the world. So it's the just thing to do to act on climate. So we consistently see, whether it's at this local city or town level, or the national level, or the global level, that leadership often combines these components: scientific and technical evidence that's credible, arguments about how the actions we need to take are actually in our self-interest. Even if they're costly now, they're in our medium and long-term self-interest. We can create jobs with them and healthier communities, and they're the right thing to do. They're the appropriate actions to take. So over and over, you see that this is a kind of recipe for leadership. And I'll pull out a couple of, it's a little bit of jargon, but I'll pull out a little bit of the kind of examples of this in policy. In policy, we often note, right, that leaders are venue shoppers, we call them, right? People who want to advocate for climate leadership, they find an institutional venue that's the most receptive. So if you think, well, right now, for a lot of climate politics in the US, a lot of activists focus on states, on different states, California, Massachusetts, Minnesota, because Washington was so difficult to move away from fossil fuels. So they venue shop, right? You start to enact policy in places that are most likely to enact it. And we see this in our everyday lives. Universities, corporations, some of them lead and some of them don't want to. So people look for the kind of institutional venue for strategic action but also action that's consistent with their values and morals to kind of drive the agenda forward. And we often say of leadership, right, that these things have spillover effects. They set examples. Well, if this works so well for this corporation, then other corporations should have stronger sustainability policies, or if it's working in particular countries. And so there's a lot of rhetoric, and in fact, a lot of it was applied to Sweden, that you lead by example. You demonstrate what's possible. So that's one of the reasons to go ahead and do something that might be a little costly in the short term, but as long as is still beneficial and it's the right thing to do. So you get this kind of venue shopping for strategic action. We see it lots of times that we're institutionalizing useful climate knowledge, right? So in every environment ministry and oftentimes in county government, in city government, in corporations, people have begun over the last 30 years to build in climate expertise, right? It's sustainability expertise. We have jobs that are called that now. Hopefully some of you students will have some of those jobs when you leave college. So you institutionalize knowledge and you institutionalize learning, right? So we've got the sustainability office in a company or in a city is often charged with trying to keep up with what other people are doing. What can we learn from what other cities are doing? What can we learn from what other companies are doing? How can we enact these policies and move forward, right? So you institutionalize knowledge and action. And you drive a sort of so-called normative change. In other words, you drive value change. You drive expectations change. So you want to define a whole bunch of energy efficiency and climate policies as the appropriate things. If you're a good city, you should be doing these things, right? If you're a responsible company, you should be doing these things. If you're a responsible state, you should be doing these things, right? And so you're driving normative change and you're trying to embed those in institutions over time. And I think our expectation often in the leadership literature is that once you win and enact the policies that you want in a country or in a state or in a corporation, then that's kind of a stable situation. You've won, you've enacted the right policy that's in our interest. And now we move on to try to enact the next thing because there's always more to do, right? But it turns out that that is not always the way things go. The last set here is that there are hosts of examples for these in the literature on climate change, mitigation, that is reducing the emissions. There's a host of examples of this in the literature on the energy transition of this kind of combination. One of my favorites is that there's a host of evidence that the European Union kind of accidentally over time discovered the power of making high standards, product standards. So my American laptop and my American iPhone, which is of course amusing because I only bought them right in the United States. They didn't actually get made there, but I've just called them my American ones. But they're made to European standards, like almost all electronic products. They're made to the EU standards because they're the highest ones. So everybody makes to the EU standard, right? And that's true of all kinds of things. I'm told that undergraduates at Uppsala sometimes like American whiskey. And so one of the other examples of making the high standard is that whether it's Jack Daniels or whatever else that's American liquor, we call them fifths. If you buy a fifth of a bottle of liquor, that's a fifth of a gallon. But they're not actually a fifth of a gallon anymore. They're 750 milliliters because that's the standard for a bottle of alcohol in the European Union. And it's true all over the world now. And there are endless examples of these. So there's this sort of power and high standard setting, and you can enact both your values, and it could be strategically influential. Now, so there's a catch, however, and we're living in the time of the catch. The opponents of climate action can learn from leadership examples too. They can study why it is the case that policies that they didn't want to happen won, right? So when you think about climate change, we're doing good. Climate change leadership successes, they study them and emulate them. They learn from the normative transformation, the kind of building of a pro-climate action consensus. And what does this lead them to do? It leads them to try to reduce legitimacy, reduce salience, or reduce the credibility of scientific and technical advice and of the normative consensus itself. So I want to kind of delegitimize these institutionalized actors. I want to convince you that these people who get paid by the city of Uppsala or who are in the environment ministry, which I gather Sweden no longer has officially, that they're the problem, right? You've institutionalized these high regulation standard makers and all of their knowledge, so you should cut their budgets, right? You should attack them in public. You should make them look like hypocrites. Well, they're concerned about all that climate change stuff, but they still fly to Brussels to a conference, right? So they must be lying to you, right? So you can use these kind of discourses or tactics to lower their legitimacy, to make them seem less credible. You can often use the various processes in politics to help delegitimize them. And this is jargon, multi-level and polycentric leadership. But in the leadership literature, there's all this talk about how one of the climate leaders have been successful with this venue shopping I mentioned, because I'll go over here and I'll get my policy enacted here first, because that's a company that might do it first. And then we'll use that example to go here. So you've got many centers. Polycentric is just an elaborate term for many centers or multiple levels in which you try to enact climate policy, from trying to convince, your parents to buy the right thing at the kitchen table to trying to convince the university to have a policy and on up to national government, right? But the thing is, and we've often used this as part of the institutional explanation about why climate leadership happens different places, and keeps building over time. But the thing is, the opponents of climate leadership have learned that too. They know that there are many ways to block, many ways to roll back, many places to go, many opportunities. So what you do here, and this is a little more jargon, but you essentially repoliticize the norms, or you repoliticize the policies and ideas. You say, well, you know, they might have been enacted for a good reason, but actually they have this bad effect. So I'm going to repoliticize the bad effect. Or you might say they weren't actually enacted for good reasons, they were lying to you. And so now we're going to try to delegitimize them. But you're coming around to question the kind of pro-climate action consensus. And you don't usually do this at the macro level, right? You don't, some political actors do, but most don't stand up and say, I don't believe in climate change. We still don't have that many actors who don't believe it at all, or at least say they don't believe it at all. We have some. But what you do is you pick piece by piece. You go after a policy in an attempt to kind of dismantle or roll it back. And one of the things I'm kind of arguing today, right, is that I think those of us who care about climate change, whether we care about it because we're scientists or social scientists or students and want to be active in it, I think we should accept that there's no magic moment coming. There's no moment in which we're going to be sure enough and agree enough that politicians are finally going to pass that really comprehensive bill in Parliament and we're going to get busy. It's not coming. That's my sort of argument. It is going to be a fight on every front. I'll spare you my Winston Churchill impersonation about fighting on the land and the sea, but that is in some respects the right metaphor or the right set of expectations. Enough scientific certainty, enough political consensus is not coming because too many actors profit from or benefit from reducing certainty and reducing legitimacy and stopping action, even for a few years. People who want these policies, who say, well, I'm not opposed to the policy, but it's too fast, right? You're trying to decarbonize the cars too quickly, right? Let's not have a 2030 deadline. Let's have a 2040 deadline, right? They're doing that because they're going to figure out how to make money in those 10 years, right? That's one of the reasons, right? Not the only, but one. So where are we now? So I think the first thing about this sort of moment of lots of climate difficulty is that we have to accept that the same opponents who have opposed climate action for 40 years are neither vanquished nor vanished. They're not gone. They're not defeated. They have maybe gone a little quieter on their critique of all science, but they still are happy to pick apart a piece of it if it's strategically important. And they still have money to make by delay and change. So they're still there. They have not lost. We say in the American English, they have deep pockets, right? In other words, they have access to lots of money, resources. They also have lots of voice. In my country, they have a whole news network that's an international network on Fox, right? And that's true in a lot of countries, right? They have podcasts, newspapers, websites, channels, commentators. So they have lots of voice and they have deep pockets. The old opponents. Secondly, we see that there are these various types. We know empirically, factually, there are these various types of rollback or backlash. And I'm working. One of the fun projects we're already kind of playing with at the invitation of my new climate leadership colleagues was with Mikael and graduate students Oscar and Frida are looking at the comparative backlash politics, and in particular they're looking at the Swedish case, and I'm trying to think more comparatively about this. But what you see in the literature, there's an emerging literature on this as well. Matt Patterson, Paul Tobin there, just a recent piece that I really like on anti-net zero activism in the UK. And the way that social science publications work is that you write them and then you submit them so they get reviewed. It takes months. You have to you revise them. By the time they've been published, you're at least several months and usually a year in. So Paul and Patterson, Wilshire, and Tobin were writing about this in 2022, and it finally came out in 2023. And the Tory government in the UK has spent much of the second half of 2023 rolling back as many climate and environmental policies as they can dream up. They're just every day in the newspaper. That's something that they're rolling back, right? And they did this very nice notion that you can, and it's really clear in British politics right now, and there are previous historical cases. You can continue to say how in favor of climate change policy and science you are, but you just don't like this requirement over here that's getting in the way of fracking because we need the gas now, right? Or I don't like that requirement because it actually requires farmers to do something that they don't want to do, and I need the farmers' votes, so let's roll that one back, right? So you don't stand up and the British Prime Minister is not going to stand up and denounce climate change as a giant hoax, but he is pretty happy to act opportunistically because he's way down in the polls to get rid of these little pesky rules here and there that add up to being popular among his constituency. And we have American examples of the Bush and Trump presidency, and we get, Hungarian, we had Bolsonaro in Brazil, lots of rollback, lots of back and forth. So we see this phenomenon happen. And so what's going on here? Why are these policies so difficult to sustain? Why are there so many opponents? Similar, Patterson, a group of them, I think I'm drawing on them. I think they're offering a very nice explanation called, it's a little jargony though, it's called scope expansion. In other words, what they're saying is that we've reached the place in climate politics where, as we have been accelerating decarbonizing electricity production, and we're starting to decarbonize automobiles, moving toward a more electrified transportation system gradually. But what's left after you do that is everyday life. Every practice in the forest, if you're a forester, agricultural practices, every food decision, all this kind of stuff, right? So that decarbonizing and reducing consumption is starting to impact the daily lives of lots of people in lots of different sectors. What do you mean? And not only that, and this is why you go back to delegitimizing and credibility, is that many of these policies are articulated by people on TV or elsewhere who have pretty high incomes, pretty high posh salaries, right? But the policies they want to cost other people money or opportunities. So this is one of those ways in which kind of you combine a kind of right-wing economic populism with the sort of opponents of particular types of climate action. One question that I think this asks us, all of us, right, is climate policy advocates, is how much do our policies and our values cost other people, right? If we want to understand why some of them are angry about some of these policies, we have to think about, what some of the policies we want enacted cost them. And it helps you get a sense of the grievances that you can tap into. But that's not the only thing. The other thing to remember is that climate change is usually comparatively low commitment among voters than the more immediate things in their lives. So if I live in a neighborhood where the townhouses just exploded, and I'm pretty upset about gang warfare or crime, I might vote for people who offer me an answer to that question, even if they don't agree with me on climate change. If I don't really like immigrants, and I want fewer of them, I might vote for those folks, even though the folks I'm going to vote for are going to roll back climate policies, and I don't really want them to do that, but other things are more important to me, right? So I think we have to accept that there's a kind of combination here of this politics of everyday life and strategic or opportunism. When you're in a political party, when you want to be a member of parliament, your job is to use the arguments you have to use in order to get there. Get enough votes to win. That's your job, unfortunately, sometimes. And so this kind of political opportunism, you exploit grievances, you set up issue linkages to other things that people are concerned about. And that helps us see why, I think, we have these periodic instances of rollback and backlash. Most people don't vote primarily on climate. Sometimes I say, to my environmental colleagues, the other word for most people is normal people. Normal people do not vote primarily on climate. They vote primarily on a whole bunch of other concerns that are very immediate to them in their lives. And so so we see this in combination, right, with political opportunism, with grievances and other things, that we get these periodic things. So for example, and it's probably true in Sweden, but I haven't looked up the polls, but very often when you have these instances of rollback of environmental policies, if you poll the public, they mostly are opposed to rollbacks of environmental standards. Usually says, well, the government just rolled this requirement back, do you approve? And usually you get pretty substantial, no, I don't approve. But they probably aren't going to vote on that basis, right? And so it's not that important. And so I think this helps us figure out where we are. Now then, a couple of examples. Good, I'm getting close. Last text-rich slide. These are drawn very systematically. Graduate students do not do this. This is not a case justification for your dissertation. These three cases are drawing very systematically from the things I'm already doing research on. Yeah, so that's not a case justification for your dissertation, but it is for my presentation. So one of my favorites is that coal phase outs, coal phase out declarations helps us illustrate our contemporary politics. We cannot, as a species, burn lots of coal and address climate change at the same time. The coal must be not burned. That's what it happens. It needs to stay in the ground and not be put into the atmosphere, right? But so the activists, right, who are pushing for coal phase outs in European states, about a third of EU members have coal phase out deadlines that are set. They wobble a little because of backlash. Those deadlines, for a few years, the deadlines were all being moved up. Since Russia invaded Ukraine and the prices of fuel have been higher and more erratic, a couple of them have wobbled back a little bit, but there's a set of these coal phase out deadlines. There are a bunch in the US states. There are a few developing countries that have declared them, right? And the activists have pushed financial institutions, the private ones, Citibank, Chase, big European and Northern banks, to declare they won't fund coal. They pushed the World Bank and the Multilateral Bank to declare that they're not going to fund or support coal. And those are all good policies if your primary concern is bring down those carbon emissions from those very dirty coal plants. They're good policies from a climate perspective. But the opponents of coal phase outs have also repoliticized those in ways, right? Because if I haven't convinced you, if you live in a coal community or a coal mining region, and I haven't convinced you that you're going to have something else to do, you're pretty angry about coal phase out, right? And that's the kind of local and national politics. But the global version of this is that if you're a policymaker or a citizen in many developing countries and you have a chronic shortage of electricity, you have a lot of energy poverty, when the World Bank says you can no longer build coal power plants, once again, people in one part of the world are telling you what you can and cannot do for your energy policy. And this is particularly acute in this example because a lot of the banks who no longer will support coal didn't take the same amount of money and say, but we want to support wind and solar instead. So those those policies to help address energy policy ended up aggregately less well-funded than they were before. Because coal, if you're sitting on a bunch of coal and you build a plant to burn it, it's cheap. It's not cheap over the long term, got all these costs. We all know this as environmental people, but it's a good way to make a lot of energy cheap. So even a very well-intentioned coal, these coal phase outs, well-intentioned, but not just well-intentioned, needed, necessary. We got to stop burning coal, but they are engendering a lot of politics, some of it post-colonial and decolonial at the global level, some of it very strategic and local, but it's tough stuff. We can go through this similarly on mining. The massive build out of mining for the energy transition is huge. Most of massive mining takes place in the developing world. There are things to mine in Europe and North America, but we don't really like the mines. They're much more expensive to do in Canada and the US, for example, if you apply environmental standards to them. So it's better to do them someplace else where you don't have those kinds of challenges. So they have huge environmental costs, huge community costs. There are a bunch of transnational governance arrangements to try to address those things, but they're mostly not very worried about environmental things. Firms have a bunch of firm-driven ones, companies that are designed essentially to help ensure their supply. That's their problem, cheap supply at a reasonable cost. States have conflict minerals. My own government has led all kinds of conflict mineral kind of requirements in the United States Congress and such. But those are justified on our security, American security, and they're anti-violence, but they're not particularly environmental, right? So you get and there was an old 60s saying, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, about the old elites coming in. Well, this is true of the global economy on these kinds of things. Meet the new economy, same as the old economy. It's very exploitive. It has low standards, and it is being driven now in part by our climate policies in the North. So it's politicized, and it's going to stay politicized. Hear me again, the same as coal. I'm not telling you that we have to stop mining because we need all that. We do need all that stuff for the energy transition. We have to do it, but there are a lot worse and a lot better ways to do it, and we are much closer to the worst ways to do it than we are to the better ways to do it in terms of global mining, right? So, and then lastly, the last example is that there are lots of really interesting initiatives around trying to protect the climate, adapt to climate, reduce emissions, store carbon, and protect biodiversity at the same time. They have lots of win-win rhetoric, double dividend, all this sort of positive stuff. Needs doing. It's essential. But when you dig into what's going on in these things, you get a financialization. What that means is that if you're going to have incentives to store the carbon, to keep the forest there, that carbon storage has to have value. It has to be a tradable commodity. So you financialize the carbon stored in the forests or stored in the land by a particular land use. But when you do that, and you can use it to help, the money to help with the environmental protection. But when you do that, right, you commoditize the carbon. It's the most valuable thing in nature when you prioritize it, right? Which means you have to manage the park for the carbon storage. If you need drones zooming around to make sure that nobody's cutting down the trees, you get the drones. Somebody, people live there, but they're still drones zooming around, making sure that you don't poach the lions or cut down a tree, right? So you get a kind of heavy technologicalization, you get a heavy financialization, and you get a strong priority on the carbon itself when you do this, not on the people who live, say, in the park, right? So again, this goal of win-win, it has to be done. We must, in fact, manage to address climate change and preserve and, in fact, enhance biodiversity. But if we look at how it's being done, we can see that there are really problematic things going on. And that, again, helps us see why these climate policies are there in our everyday lives. They're in other people's everyday lives, here in Sweden or far away. And they are going to stay political and fractious. And there's too much injustice in them. because of course there's so much injustice in the systems we have, even if we take climate change out of the picture, right? So there we go. That is my answer. They're not going to get easier. They're not going to get less political. Science is not going to become so certain that we all magically all decide to act. It's awesome that science has become more certain on climate change. That's good. I mean, it's mostly good. It would be nice to believe they were wrong, but they're not about climate change. But that is where we are. Thank you very much for listening, and with a shameless plug of the new book.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy, for this introduction and for telling us about your research and work and your thoughts, why we are running into all these obstacles when we try to decarbonize. And basically, you're saying we're more or less standing where we stood before, but with new issues, but the same challenges as before in a way or two. To discuss this further, we have a panel. I would like you to come up here. We have Charles Parker, who is Professor of Political Science here at Uppsala University. Nagmen Nasiritusi, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Researcher Climate Change Leadership. And Johanna Sandahl, who is President of the European Environmental Bureau, which is the largest environmental organization in Europe and on Earth, actually, if you count the individuals being members. We also had a fourth person who was supposed to be here, Annika Jakobsson, who is kind of climate general in the city of Stockholm and has a background in the environment ministry as state secretary, but she has become ill. She got the flu, so I hope she recovers. But I know that we have some people in the audience here, other previous state secretaries and others who can hopefully put in the political perspective when we move into the discussion with the audience. So I would like to start with asking you to briefly reflect, really pick up the points you think that you would like to comment on, reflect on what Stacy brought up here before. Would you like to start, Charles?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for a fascinating lecture, Stacy. I think you really outlined some of the challenges. It is a challenge. I know that environmental scientists, they like to say an ecosystem is never saved, it's always being saved. And I think you're right that the progress we've made has not been secured, and the distance we still have to travel is quite a journey still. And one thing you said that I really agreed with is there is no magic moment. And even though I think the science is getting much clearer, we've had 3 intergovernmental panel on climate change reports come out recently, where the science is clearer than ever. We've had people have been saying that Mother Nature has been staging an intervention the last 2 years with all the natural hazard events that are very clearly connected towards science. We know that there is no safe zone. So even now, we're already seeing dangerous climate impacts. And a lot of people think these are going to be some magic wake-up moment, and then we're going to finally get religion and we're going to act. But in fact, some of the research I've done with colleagues here at the Center for Natural Hazards and Disaster Sciences, where we've tried to look at, do natural hazard events cause policy change? I've done this with my colleagues Daniel Morstedt and Giuliano Di Bassardi, the director. And we find that natural hazards really, it can provoke change, but the pattern is not the case. So that's true of disaster risk reduction. And then if you look in a place where you'd think people would be more responsive, like cities and climate adaptation, once again, we don't see it. Major floods, we don't see it. So we can't just expect this to happen naturally. And I've been in some big research projects like Stacy, and the interdisciplinary projects I think are very important. But one thing I noticed was that the natural scientists, they tend to think that well, we're going to present the evidence to the public and the policymakers. We can show the cause and effects. We're going to get action. Then we have our economist firms, and they're very good about coming up with solutions, doing cost-benefit analysis. And they say, well, this is going to cause the policymakers and the public to say, well, it's clearly better to do something now. The sort of Nicholas Stern that we should act now, acting now is cheaper, and the solutions are actually getting less and less expensive all the time, but yet we still see shortfalls in our response. But this is unfortunately where my subject comes in, and Stacy's subject, political science. They say that economics is a dismal science. Well, I think maybe political science is a much more dismal science. And it was Aristotle that said everything happens in a political context. And this is often because we have so many special interests and stakeholders where we don't see people responding to the science or to the policy instruments we have. And I think that that is something that we have to always remember as we try to persuade the public and persuade policymakers. But I'm going to close by saying, though, that I'm not completely pessimistic, because I think all the science and the accumulating knowledge does matter. So if it wasn't for the science, I don't think we would have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. If it wasn't for the science, I don't think we would have the Paris Agreement. And that's something I'd be interested in hearing Stacy's thoughts on. We have, starting on the 30th November, COP28, the Conference of Party meeting, to look at the performance of cooperation through Paris. And one of the things that's interesting is we just got, this is a stock take year. We're evaluating the performance so far and trying to make sense of where we're going. And I was looking at this, and on one hand, you see some glimmers of hope. Some progress has been made with the national determined contributions, the pledges. So we're bending slowly the temperature rise down. We're probably going to blow past 1.5, probably 2. But basically what we're talking about is 2.4 to 2.6 degrees, according to the report, compared to 3.7 to 4.8 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which the estimates in 2020. That's the good news. The bad news is, of course, greenhouse gas emissions still climbing, finance promises by rich countries delinquent, adaptation support insufficient. But I like this key finding number 6 in the report. And that is saying that we need policy transformation. We need policy transformation and phasing out fossil fuels, like Stacy said. We need policy transformation and implementing renewable energy, and of course, ending deforestation. And the good thing is, the IPCC and this report says we actually have a lot of solutions there now. The challenge, of course, is actually implementing them and sustaining them. And I'd be interested in hearing from Stacy, because he told us about all the challenges. Does he see any glimmers of hope? And maybe there's glimmers. But of course, you know, despair is not an option either. So I'd be interested in what sort of promising trends he sees as well. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Johanna, what's on your mind when you have heard Stacy and Charles as well?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Very, very inspiring or very interesting lecture. And perhaps, I mean, I felt that you spoke to me, a person who's been working within the environmental NGO sphere for, I don't know, 3 decades or something like that. And I very much, I mean, what you're talking about is very familiar to me in the way that how you describe how we and perhaps wider sphere of people, politicians, have worked in the sense of, you know, bringing up or down uncertainty. Confidence and uncertainty is stronger. Public and policymaker awareness is stronger, and climate impact visibility is stronger. All these things is exactly how we traditionally have been working for forever, I would guess, as the environmental NGO sector. And at the moment, I feel that we are, in a sense, struggling. We are, and I mean, the whole ENGO community is struggling. We also see that, I think, in the way that we now see perhaps other or new organizations or movements growing stronger. and the traditional environmental NGOs way of working is being questioned as well, from other groups being perhaps more radical, new methods or old new methods being used in the streets, in the parliament, etc., etc. And the traditional NGO community is, as I mentioned, struggling, trying to find all these new ways of, or how should we deal with this question? And perhaps I was thinking what you said, that about co-producing knowledge, and I think that traditionally we might have been good in taking on board science, the facts, what's happening to the climate, to the biodiversity, etc., but not as good bringing in political science, the humanities, all these other scientific arenas that we also, as environmental NGOs, need to know about and need to learn and perhaps co-produce knowledge to be able to find new ways forward. So, I mean, thank you a lot. And I mean, this very much raises a lot of questions in my head. How can we make use of this? Thanks.
Thanks, Johanna. Mikael, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. Thank you so much for that excellent presentation. You bring lots of perspectives on this topical question. I particularly agree with you highlighting the central role of politics. As someone who studies climate change politics, these are things I've been thinking about a lot. But yet, your way of outlining this brought some new ideas into my head. And I'm particularly thinking of another political science focus, which is democracy. And it's been celebrated a lot, and everyone knows it's the sort of best working model we have. But yet we're seeing backlash against democracy as well. So there's definitely something in there about how different actors see interests in different things, and how sort of these compromises that we make have effects that affect other people. And so the conflictual politics of climate change, I think we need to study a lot more. And there, I think there has been a bias in the literature where we focus on the good cases, things that have been successful. But the point about interdisciplinarity also applies to political science, I think, that we have all these different strands in political science, like political economy, that talks about power, vested interests, that we need to study a lot more, I think. And you're completely correct on this climate change politics of everyday life. So in Sweden, for example, we have low emissions from the electricity sector. And that was because during the oil crisis in the 70s, politicians made the decision that we shouldn't rely so much on fossil fuels. And so that didn't impact people's lives too much. But now when we're getting to the other sectors that sort of depend on how we behave, that impacts on people's lives. And we have, big elections coming up next year in many regions of the world. And I think that's sort of goes to the heart of it. How do we make the climate issue resonate with people's lives? And sort of how do we look at the arguments for why we need climate action and make it resonate? But what I think is the key thing to understand is that what you also said, justice is at the heart of this. So at the international level, we've had countries arguing about who should take climate action. So we have rich countries that have benefited from fossil fuels, and we have poorer countries that are trying to develop. And a lot of the conflicts have been sort of who pays for what. And now what we're seeing at the domestic level is we have the Paris Agreement. All countries need to decarbonize. And we're seeing the domestic politics come in as well, sort of the local versus the national interests. Who should bear the costs of decarbonizing? But we also know that there are lots of winners from decarbonizing. And so this coalition building, getting the actors on board, I think that's what we need to sort of focus on as well. And the glimmer of hope that you mentioned, what I see is, even though we're seeing, for example, in the UK with the rollbacks, they are not winning votes on this anymore. They're getting lots of pushback. They're saying they're not following the science. And so I think there is something there still that the better argument is that we need to take climate action.
Thank you, Mikael. Well, the three of you raised a number of interesting points, but I would like to ask you to start with. I mean, Stacy tried to elaborate on and to some extent answer the question, why is so little happening when we know so much, and when we know much more today about the problems. As you said, Stacy, we've reduced uncertainty. We're better in describing and implementing new technologies, new solutions. We know how to do with behavior. We know much more. We have the economic case speaking in favor of decarbonization or climate mitigation, but still the gaps are huge. And 25 years ago, we thought that, or 30 years ago, we thought that, well, once we have more knowledge, things will improve much more rapidly than they're doing. There is, of course, as you said, Charles, improvement. Instead of having 3 to 4 degrees by the end of this century, we have 2.5 or perhaps even 1.8, according to some estimates, which is, I mean, much better outcome by the end of the century than 3-4 degrees warming. I remember this course in the end of the 1990s in environmental science, when we had a panel in the end of the course when students asked teachers a lot of questions, and one of them asked, well, will there be a market for us to work on environmental issues when we have graduated in the future? And we were some teachers looking, no, yeah, maybe for some years. So what's this strong hope that things will improve rapidly? So why is progress so slow? What would you say here in the panel? Why do we see these huge gaps between state of the environment or in climate and what we do, the measures we take? And so we even can look at the political objectives and implementation in terms of policies. And so, Charles.
So first of all, I mean, I agree with what's been said. I mean, democracy, the crisis in the climate needs to be solved through the crisis in democracy. You cannot get action unless you win the argument. So I think that's very important, even for those of us who think, well, the science is so clear, but we can't just assume others are going to get this. We have to win the conversation. We have to keep winning it. And as Stacy said, people are studying the areas where we have made progress and tried to win, and they're mounting counterattacks. That's very important to think about. Timescale. Well, it depends on how you think about things. I mean, so we celebrated not so long ago the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, which took place in 1972 and was really the first global conference on environmental issues. And interestingly enough, at this conference, climate change was barely mentioned, wasn't really top of the agenda issue. So we didn't have the first UN meeting on climate change until 1979. Then in the 1980s, we got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. 1992 at the Rio Conference, the UNFCCC was launched. We had the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s, didn't work out so well. And then a push to replace that, EU partially leading that charge, cooperating together with China and the US to get the Paris Agreement, 2015. So now we have about 8 years of operation. So by diplomatic time, this is actually very rapid. Very rapid. And I think Paris has a very interesting institutional design with ratcheting up the goals every 5 years, the stock taking, which is a way of introducing accountability. And actually another role of science and NGOs is actually holding states accountable, because we see there's a big gap in what they promise and what needs to be done. All that is useful. The problem is it's not happening on the time span that we need to address the crisis. Because we all know from the IPCC and from the latest stock taking report that the window is still open, but it's rapidly closing. And there's when you can get a little more pessimistic. We see a lot of the solutions, but the question is, will they be implemented on scale in a time necessary to address these issues? But something else Enigma said was, or you said to me, Michael, that, you know, perhaps 1.8 seems even realistic if you think about all these net zero pledges and if those are done. And as we know from the 1.5 degree report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, every fraction of degree matters. So first of all, not making the problem worse is important. But then I think it's mobilizing the different stakeholders that are going to benefit from the transition and thinking about winning that conversation. I'm not certain if that can be done, but I do think if you look at some of the energy mix that's happening today, there's some reasons for cautious optimism. I also think about the politics in certain places like the EU in response to the energy crisis because of the war in Ukraine, and then in response to COVID, we have the European Green Deal, we have the European climate law, we have Fit for 55, now 57 degrees, the goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. This is inspiring in the United States. There's also pocket of actions. The place where I come from, California, is also prioritizing climate change. And we can talk about some of the imperfections of that, but I think there are some glimmers of hope.
But would you say that, is it in nature of the, you said in terms of with a diplomatic clock ticking, this is rapid. Would you say, is it in political system to be unable to respond rapidly to crisis of this magnitude?
Well, I mean, this
is inherent in the.
This is a classic warning response problem, and people who study warning response problems, even if the negative consequences are quite foreseeable, there's lots of barriers in human psychology and in human institutions and in governments that tell us that, well, the likely outcome is that governments won't respond in time. But the good news is that we do have a lot of adaptive capacity, so it's not impossible. So, but I mean, there's no sugarcoating the reality that in terms of the warning response problem, that so far the response is not adequate to all. I mean, the system is blinking bright red, and we're starting to notice, but we're not moving quickly enough. But there are now some solutions being implemented. The question is, can those be accelerated in time?
Yeah. Johanna, the red light is blinking now. Why do you, what's your understanding? Why is progress so slow in terms of mitigation? Also in relation to the adopted targets on EU level, for instance, where you are active?
Yeah. Well, of course, I would be happy to, tell you the truth where, because then I would definitely try to adapt that into strategies. But, well, so I don't know, but I think that the fact that, that we're now noticing that measures are affecting people's everyday life. Of course, that has a very strong, it affects this problem very strongly, and that politicians need to, in a sense, adapt to or listen to their voters. That is, of course, very important. I think it's very sad that this happens at the same time as another trend, mainly the move from some kind of solidarity to individualism. At least, that's happened in Sweden in the last decade a lot. And nowadays, you cannot, no political parties are arguing with solidarity as a reason for acting. That doesn't happen. And when this trend or phenomena is happening at the same time as the measures are affecting people's lives directly in terms of economy, of course, that creates some hurdles. But I'm sure there are a lot of aspects to this, and perhaps what you were touching upon with expectations and the real urgency. It's this need to happen really, really quickly compared to other struggles, workers' rights, human rights, or women's rights. From a historical perspective, this has to happen much quicker, but it's some inertia in the system.
Nigel, I would like to ask you the same question, but also, Charles referred to the Paris Agreement as a leap forward in terms, if you look at what has happened since 1992, things have accelerated in policymaking. And I think it's striking to see that there have been great things happening that could have been the best excuses possible to sort of leave from the side of the European Union, to leave the Paris Agreement. US dropped out and said this is just a Chinese tricks, and they had a baby-like president in a way, and we had the pandemic, and we have a war on the continent, and all these great things could have been, I mean, von der Leyen and the EU Commission could have said, yeah, you know, we have war, we have pandemic, we can't deal with the climate now, but EU has continued and actually accelerated its work. So, I mean, there must be some hope in the political system to be able to, but is it inherently too slow, would you say? Or what's your take as a political scientist? Can the political system sort of adapt to these red lights and accelerate things?
Well, I think to start with, the political system is complex. So we have the multi-level governance that you mentioned, the polycentricity, that there are many actors involved. And the challenge is so massive because the global economic system that we all rely on is heavily relying on fossil fuels. And so if you think about sort of the challenge, then I think we made massive progress, even though it took 26 COPs to get coal mentioned in the document. So now with the global stocktake, they're mentioning the phase out of fossil fuels, huge achievement. Many said that was impossible because each country has the capacity to stop and block. So we'll see if they will get it through in the final declaration or not. But still, that we are having these conversations means that we've made progress. And I think that climate leadership there is a huge factor, that there are countries that want to seem courageous and act and follow the science. And that, of course, inspires other actors to act. And that's what you were on about, that we are learning across borders. It matters what we all do. Unfortunately, the ones that want to stop it are also learning across borders. But still, that we are making progress on discussing what actually is at the heart of the problem. And so by joining these coalitions of the willing, then I think, but also experimenting with the political system. Because we shouldn't.
Would you say that is the political leadership getting stronger or weaker?
It feels like, you know, the whack-the-mole thing that sort of goes down somewhere and then comes up somewhere else. So it's moving around. So at the moment, we're seeing a massive push for a reform of the financial system, and that's being driven by small island states mainly, because they're seeing the urgency of changing things in the financial system. So I think, if we want to find leaders, we can find them. But unfortunately, in some places here, we're not seeing them anymore. Thank you.
Stacy will come back in a while and comment on what you have said, but I think the professorship, the visiting professor in climate leadership, I mean, that's a scientific role in a way. So I would like to ask you in the panel, what role do you think science should and can play in this context? Is it the responsibility of the scientists to sort of speak out and take a stance on these issues, or should scientists be sort of the objective person watching what's happening, describing it, or do you think that science fulfills the role that they think it should have? I mean, you have your two scientists and one from, let's say, the other side of this arena in the civil society. So, Johanna, do you think that scientists are helpful enough here? Charles, would you like to start?
So, I mean, I, of course, think science is indispensable, but I think Stacy did a good job of explaining that it doesn't necessarily for the public and policymakers speak for itself. Therefore, it has to be translated. And I think sometimes if you think about like James Hansen, who was one of the early science policy entrepreneurs in the US, you can see that he was very cautious, understandably. And scientists, they don't want to get over their skis, and they do not want to exaggerate what they know. And therefore, I think perhaps scientists need to, while maintaining rigorous honesty, try to explain what the probabilities of their conclusions are. But they also have to be careful that if they move too much into the advocacy role and start only talking about worst case scenarios without explaining that these are one possible future, when worst case scenarios don't come true exactly on the timescale, sometimes people do, that can be used by opponents to undermine credibility. So I think scientists really have to be dedicated to following the science, first of all. Then it's up to the rest of us in the policy world to sort of use that as a basis for making reasonable responses to the warnings that the science is giving us. And as I said, I think that the warnings are really crystal clear. In fact, one of the things that science is getting better at is the attribution science, which is linking specific hazard events, the frequency, and also the intensity of them to climate change. And I think that type of science can be used both by scientists and communicators and policymakers and political scientists to sort of make the case for what reasonable policy responses are. Was that what you were looking for?
Yeah, I can just follow up there, because I mean, natural scientists, they describe the problem and tend to be, I mean, depending on the rhetoric and how they sort of underline different probabilities for different events, they will be described as alarming too much or too little and so. But on the social science side, I would say, I don't know if you agree, but I would say that those dominating the public debate are the economists, and most economists don't know much about climate economics and tend to talk about costs. Do you think that political scientists take the responsibility that you could expect, since you're paid by the government, to sort of bring in sufficient knowledge and knowledge that's precise enough to be possible to use in the political system?
I mean, therefore, once again, as a good social scientist, I always feel like I should be very humble about the impact that political scientists or social scientists can have in the political space, but maybe not so humble not to try to make a difference, or at least try to communicate and engage in that sort of third mission that Swedish universities are supposed to engage, which are supposed to be communication for the broader public. But I mean, that is, of course, a tricky thing. So, I mean, I think you have to make the effort. I think the biggest impact we probably have is on our students, because I think they're the ones that are going to be occupying these jobs and actually be perhaps green compliance officers in industry. So I think that makes a difference. I think to the extent that you can participate in forums where policymakers are interested in what social science has to say, that's valuable too. But I also think that we have to be kind of humble in terms of just getting our hands on the wheels and thinking that we can steer the ship better. But that's just some reflections. But it's a tough question. No easy answer.
Jana, what's your, how do you see the role of science and how scientists act in relation to the climate crisis?
Well, I think it can definitely be more collaboration between, I mean, the arena where I come from, the environmental NGO sphere, and scientists, and specifically, I think, social sciences, political science, because in a sense, we don't need more natural science. I mean, we know the problem. Every year we get new reports. It's getting worse, you know, in this arena or that arena. We have the proof already, but we need more collaboration and co-producing perhaps knowledge with the social sciences. And I think, I mean, it's I meet a lot of researchers, and some are very interested in you know, conveying their research, their message, but sometimes I also meet those, perhaps no one here, that is actually not interested in having the political sphere as a target group, which and I mean, even though that specific research is very relevant to what's happening around us, to the politicians. And that makes me sometimes a bit worried, because I think that it's very important that if you do research on such a topic, and it can be policy relevant, of course, you should be interested to, you know, somehow convey that message. Perhaps not by yourself, but at least, you know, make sure other actors, such as environmental NGOs, can pick up the message and do something with it.
Mm. Thank you. Nigel, we attended together with Stacy as well last week the Swedish Political Scientists Association, the annual conference, and this topic came up as a discussion in the end, whether or not political scientists are sufficiently active in the public debate where economists tend to dominate. And what's your view on these issues?
Yeah, so political science has traditionally been very focused on developing theories and not so much on the applied side of things. So there was this hesitancy that we're not used to being able to advise or sort of, get our recommendations out there, because that's not what we do as political scientists. But I feel that it is changing. And I agree that it's really important that if you've been funded by taxpayers and you sit on a lot of knowledge, to get that voice out there, and especially during this period where in Tidöavtalet it says that climate policy should be science-based, and it's not, then I think it's our responsibility to point out the inconsistencies. So I could completely agree that we need to be humble, but where we see sort of like clear inconsistencies, I feel that we should contribute to the public debates.
Thank you. You have referred, all of you, to COP28 in one way or another. What are your expectations now when this meeting starts in December? 2 weeks. We have the global stocktake, but also topics will come up about losses and damages. Financing is not there as promised already in 2009 in Copenhagen. It took, what did you say, 26 COPs before coal could be mentioned. What do you expect? What would be the best and the worst outcome as you see it, John?
Well, I mean, this is going to be an interesting test of the review process. And it's kind of interesting because it was very studiously avoided calling this verification. We're also not holding individual countries. So it's not an evaluation of how individual countries are doing living up to their standards. This is more of a collective. So once again, it's going to put a highlight on the gap between what's been promised and what needs to be done. And it's a pledge and review system. And the next big test, actually, I think is going to be in 2025. And that is when the next round of ratcheting is required. So we've had one round of ratcheting, and most people did make promises, but they didn't exactly dazzle us with the increasing their ambition. So I think 2025 is going to be the first real test. And then to the extent that the stocktake plays into that, I think that's important. We also know that at these COP meetings, there's a tendency that when things have been settled before, they tend to be constantly relitigated. So that's something to keep watch over, to make sure there's not backsliding. You may know that the president of the COP is the head of the oil company from the UAE. So that is kind of like something that sends off alarm bells in some quarters, obviously. And at these COP meetings, there's a lot of usual fossil fuel interests running around. So it'll be interesting to see whether they are able to tamp down this fossil fuel phase out to phase down, or not even mention it. It wasn't mentioned in Egypt last year, for example. So that's an interesting battle to watch.
He asked the countries now recently to ratchet up already and improve their indices. And I think the number of governments that responded was 0.
Yeah, so in Glasgow, governments were encouraged to not wait till the next official ratcheting. But as we all know in international relations, voluntary deadlines tend to be ignored. People blow right through them. So it's when you actually have a deadline, it's unfortunate that you didn't see people volunteering to update their promises and pledges every year. But to me, that was expected. So to me, 2025 is an interesting test of this. So we will see what happens. And I mean, as we know, it's not just pledges, it's about doing. So I would say the ratio of talking to doing, too much talking, not enough doing. So pledges are important, but I think we also need to be holding people accountable for what they've already promised to do. And there, I think the NGO community, Climate Action Track and others are doing interesting work, and academics as well, sort of looking at how serious the promises are, and then to what extent they're actually being implemented. So I think that's another role for science, people in the academy and NGO community to collaborate and try to shine a spotlight on what is and isn't being done.
Johanna, what expectations do you have?
Well, high, of course. No. Well, in addition to what you said, which I agree with, is perhaps around what role the EU will take. I mean, now we have the coming years, of course, very important things will happen. There's an EU election, as you know, next spring, and what we see now in the Parliament and perhaps also in the Commission a bit is sort of a backlash. And I mean, you look at the EU Green Deal, Fit for 55, it's of course the climate negotiations are more or less over and it's settled, but there are so many other topics on the table around biodiversity, chemicals, etc., that is now being pushed back by certain parts of the Parliament, etc. So ahead of the COP, it will be interesting to see what will happen.
Do you think the European Commission might play down its role, or?
I'm wondering. I don't know. I hope, of course, not. But I see definitely a risk. And also, I mean, they are, of course, also for the Leyen is thinking of her future and how can she act in this situation ahead of the election.
Nagbe, what do you expect from COP28?
So I expect a lot of focus on the global stocktake, as this is the first time it's being carried out. So we've seen a technical report and now first collection of parties' different views on what should be in this global stocktake outcome. And it's fascinating reading. It's so many different interests, different country groupings want different things mentioned, of course. So how the COP presidency will bring it all together will be super interesting to watch. So yeah, with the fossil fuels, will it still remain there or will they somehow take it out?
But none of you raised the risk for a collapse. What if this promise to put some kind of regulatory framework in place for losses and damages, if that would fail? And the promised very insufficient $100 billion in climate financing will not come on the table this time either. Could we see, is there a risk for a collapse when this is also chaired by a person strongly Western, with a strong vested interest in the oil sector?
So first of all, I think finance is actually one of the areas that the rich countries of the world really need to deliver. It's a highly visible goal. 100 billion a year was supposed to be mobilized. They fell short of that. And I think that undermines the legitimacy and basically the implicit promise between the developed and developing countries. They still use that terminology in the UNFCCC context. In fact, countries like China fight to be labeled developing, whether they should be or not is another discussion. But I think that's something that the Western countries, the global North, the rich countries need to step up and deliver. And also making sure more of that money goes to climate adaptation, which is helping the most vulnerable countries dealing with the climate impacts they're already suffering now. Loss and damage mechanism, that is something that the United States and the EU has always resisted. They're petrified about liability, and the liability is studiously avoided in this. And there's two ways of looking at it. So we're finally making progress on this, and we're going to have another fund. Now, whether we need another fund, that could be debatable, but that was very important for a certain set of the G77 countries. But another cynical way of looking at it is we're giving them a mechanism, but we're going to spend a lot of time studying it implementing it slowly, and it's actually a delay tactic. So that will be one of the interesting things to watch, whether we actually make progress on that, whether it's meaningful, whether we can actually fill up this mechanism with money to be distributed. So that, along with work on adaptation and finance and tech transfer, these are, I think, all perpetually interesting issues to look at. And it's very crucial for holding this group of over 190, almost 200 countries together in a consensus-based system. Not easy to do.
Johanna?
I don't know if I have anything to add. I hope there's no collapse.
Well, I've been to many of these COPs, and always before the COPs, it's like, oh, will it collapse? And it hasn't. My colleague Alexandra and I, we've done lots of interviews about the future of the UNFCCC, and what we find is that even though stakeholders admit that it's going very slow, everyone sees the value in having the process. So I don't think it will collapse. There will be probably lots of drama. But I think there is this recognition that the UNFCCC is a key forum for these discussions.
Thank you. We could go on here for quite some time, but I would like to invite Stacy to come up, and some of you raised more precise questions to Stacy, but I would like to come up and just reflect generally or pick up on the points you want before we open up for questions from you in the audience as well. So please stay here, all of you. Stacy, what have you heard? What's your take now?
That was great. Thank you so much. A couple of things. Yeah, I think it is right to look for hope. And that I think that there are lots of experiments, policy experiments, lots of leadership still going. I agree with that. I think there is plenty of room to be both very hopeful and very concerned at the same time, right? And I think so. A couple of places. I think one of the hopeful things about the sort of new kind of climate youth movement is not just its impatience, which is of course very great, but I actually think one of the things that's really encouraging about the global youth movement, climate movement now, is that it is much more explicitly a critique of power and its own states. It's not that marches are being organized just because we need more climate policy. It's that marches tend to include very heavy doses of rhetoric about corruption, about the fact that states are failing their youngest citizens, and they are failing it because people who slow things down are making a lot of money and getting a lot of power in the process. So I mean, I think actually that is a hopeful thing, because it isn't just that we don't have adequate climate policy. It actually is broader problem that our states really don't respond to many needs in society, and climate just happens to be one of the ones that's big on the list, right? So a more direct critique of how we govern ourselves, I think, is a hopeful sign, and the anger is good. On the question of science, I'll just say that this is bad news for some scientists, but I think actually good news is that I think actually a kind of general argument about the role of social science and natural and technical sciences is that they cannot not be citizens. This is the thing, right? So how active, how political, how loud in the political you want to be as a scientist, I think there's going to be a range of individual choices about that. But I think if one imagines that you can just sort of sit around and do your science and hope that the world doesn't burn itself to death, that is the wrong choice, right? And just a couple of examples, like many who don't want to be loud and out front in a kind of political, NGO advocacy way, there are other things to do, like informally advise the city of Uppsala, or so there are lots of ways that are using your science and engaging as citizens for those who don't want to be loud and political. But I also think that there are social scientists and more of them should be a little louder and more political, and their colleagues should not punish them for it. So I also think that, you know, this kind of old culture of sort of looking down on having politics is in the way of good climate advice, but it's also actually in the way of lots of justice, not just climate justice. It's, you know, other kinds as well. So I think partly we could, we in university culture should not give our younger assistant and professors and lecturers reason to worry about their politics. They should be able to do good science and have politics, and we shouldn't punish them for one of those things. And so that we can elbow space for in university culture, I think. I'm less sanguine about political science. I think political science has mostly failed to engage the real world in ways that are very disappointing, which is why in my country we have policy schools, why there are peace and conflict departments here and other places, is because political scientists have been so indifferent to the actual problems in the societies they study. So that's a separate soapbox, and I'll step down now.
Thank you very much. So time for questions. Please be brief, no long speeches, then I will interrupt you. And please also introduce yourself briefly. We have microphones hanging from the roof, so yes, yellow jacket up there.
No micro.
They are hanging from the roof, so just stand up and talk loud.
I won't waste time with my presentation, if it's okay. Address the issue that has brought by Stacy and by the panelists. The public opinion is a contested field. So the non-saliency of climate in the normal population, it's problematic. So I would address the issue of cultural warfare, of propaganda being waged so that climate issues are denied, especially by far-right parties that are climate deniers. So this is my short provocation. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will gather 3 questions. I see that Stacy is writing, so it works well. Yes.
Jan Lindahl from Klimatfixdagen. So across Europe and across the world, we have seen an uptake of what's the quote? Deliberative democracy movement or episodes where you're trying to involve the public in decision making in the democracy. We have been a bit slow in Sweden to take that up, but now there's actually a wave of that in Sweden too coming up. What do you think about that? What should we in the climate movements think about when we are arranging those events?
Thank you. And we have a 3rd question. We will have plenty of time for picking up more questions. Yes, Lars.
Yes, I'm Lars Rydén. I'm emeritus at the Baltic University program, where we both are. I think I would like to bring up the sort of elephant in the room, the growth, economic growth, which one is confronted with every time one tries to argue for something else. For example, a different measure for success in society, which is slowly being implemented in some countries. But economic growth has been there, challenging all the time from 1972 with limits to growth. It was not sort of accepted by the politicians until 30 or even so more years later. And it's still there to be confronted with. So it would be interesting to hear your comments on that. How to deal with it.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions, one on public opinion, cultural warfare on the right, one on deliberative democracy, and one on as expected, on growth. Stacy, would you like to start, and then you can sort of jump in where you think that you want to?
Sure, I'll be quick. I think public opinion does matter, of course, and public information. But I think if we imagine that the public is ever going to be, overwhelmingly motivated by climate, we have the wrong imagination. I think that's because most people have more immediate concerns. But the point you raise about organized disinformation and misinformation absolutely has to be confronted and addressed. we can't be silent in the face of people who are clearly purposefully misleading parts of the public so that they can make money and other things. I think the deliberative democracy turners are really great. There is an area of political science doing kind of comparatively looking at these across states that I think is really, really interesting. For one of the biggest reasons I think they're interesting is precisely because we don't seem to have great spaces for deliberative public discussions now. We have, lots of yelling at one another on television, cable channels and such, and that's not the same thing. And the last thing on growth. I think the details of of how to measure economic growth do matter. And I think actually, especially the critique of national growth statistics and people's concern about them is that when some parts of growth are actually tearing things down and other parts of growth are building society over the long term, we have bad measures and bad goals, right? So I don't think we're going to arrive at a place where we decide we don't want economic growth, but I do think that the discussion about opening up what we count as good growth and bad growth is really important.
Thank you. Naima, would you like to comment
Sure.
on any of these questions?
So I agree with Stacy. And I think these three questions go nicely together. So the growth issue, I know the UN is doing a lot of work on this. The next year, they're preparing a summit for the future. And I think this will be part of it to discuss new measures. So we don't just focus on the traditional economic measures. But the deliberative democracy processes, I think, are one way of sort of trying to sit down, get people to engage with the science and to engage with each other, to test different arguments, and to sort of get away from this populism of easy solutions, because we know that these topics are very complicated. So when citizens get the chance to sit down and take the science in and deliberate with each other, we have seen a lot of positive results. So it's encouraging that it's also being introduced in Sweden.
Thank you. Well, perhaps about growth, I think, of course, this is a discussion that is very frequently occurring in the environmental NGOs. And I think that, well, to a certain degree, there is an agreement about that. Of course, the quality is very, very important. And that also that we don't know that it will be a positive result if there is degrowth. There is no guarantee there. So, but definitely a criticism around what the growth we see today has produced or is devastating to the planet. But so instead focusing on other measures, what we want to achieve in terms of social and environmental sustainability. So yeah, something like that.
So I'll start with the growth issue as well. And I mean, obviously, one of the things that needs to be done is putting a price on environmentally damaging externalities, in the language of the economists, and putting mandates and ways of rewarding more green growth. And I think of the European Green Deal as one way of doing that. I think of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is not going to do much to reduce inflation, but has a lot of goodies for people to do the right thing and get paid for it. We'll see how it actually plays out in implementation, but it's the most substantial investment in climate the United States government has ever made. So it'll be interesting to see what type of impact that does. And in terms of deliberative democracy and public opinion, I mean, that's the challenge, winning the conversation. And there, I think, is Stacy's insight is you have to make it connect to people's everyday lives and also how solutions can make a difference to them. And if you live in California, the threat of wildfire is very real. If you live in Europe, the threat of flooding is very real, torrential downpours. And then how climate adaptation and mitigation can make a difference to you. And also that there are things that we can do that are affordable and beneficial. So not just despair. And that's difficult. And also to link it back to something Stacy said, the youth movement. I mean, politicians pay attention when young people are mobilized. There's a reason why world leaders all want to meet with Greta Thunberg and know who she is. If you can mobilize that many people, politicians that need to be reelected, they will notice. And that, I think, is one of the keys. I remember Mr. Obama, he would say, for things that he cared about, well, make me do it. Put the pressure on me. So in other words, there's a role from citizens pushing their policymakers and governments.
Thank you. That is actually something that a number of environmental ministers in Sweden have said in the past. Since I'm moderating, I will not comment on growth unless someone asks me explicitly. I would like to say, though, that in terms of counteracting science denial, we have research on that in our group. One of the PhD students, Laila Mendy, is working on that, and also deliberative mini-publics will come as a result of Mr. Forma's program called FairTrans, but I'm not going to say more about that now. But so we move to, I see one question there.
Me?
Yes, you, and then one up there, and you. Here. Okay.
Also, Sven, peace and conflict. Thank you, Stacy, for an interesting lecture, and also thank you for siding with us, not the political side. I wanted to ask a question that I won't ask, but didn't want to ask this question. I will ask because all these discussions have been, no one mentioned adaptation, and I think you know why I didn't want to ask this question. I think it's important to bring that to the table. That how much climate leadership is present in the West, particularly in Europe, to address this adaptation issue. We really ever can bring this politically manageable to make this happen.
Thank you. So in the top, no, not you. You.
Scientists cannot stop citizens. But what about those who are not global citizens? Is there a willingness to promote or to co-produce not only with the global south, but maybe with immigrants or with a native community that they are usually not represented by the state in this kind of global spaces for dialogue? Thank you.
And you here in the front.
Thank you. First of all, I love your tenacity in this. I would probably have left and started doing something else. So that's good. You scientists are definitely needed in this conversation. So over to my question about this. Well, actually, first an observation. In the invite, I think it said that there will be people from business in the panel. I don't see anyone from the business in the panel. I would recommend next time, maybe someone from Sandvik or SKF, a large manufacturing company, should probably attend. I think that view would be excellent in this type of conversation. Okay, over to my question. So, geopolitical aspect of this, we can see that probably around 90% of all component that goes into electrical vehicles, batteries, and so on, is produced in China. At the same time, in the European Union, there has been a long and hard conversation around mining, but we don't see any new mines in Sweden. I have personally worked in mining industry for years, and I know that there are companies, our company wanted to start a mine in Sweden, we couldn't. It would take 10, 15 years to get an environmental permit. Doesn't make sense. So how can we make sure that we can actually make things happen when we have these kind of environmental laws that are actually counterproductive to the climate change needs? Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I would like to ask the panel to comment on what, not all the topics necessarily, all of you, but where you think you have something to contribute with and say in particular. But we had Volvo last year, but no NGO. Now we have the other way around. So yeah, follow us over the years and you will get your business representatives here. But it seems that you are the one now. So good that you're here. Stacy.
Adaptation, there isn't enough climate leadership on adaptation, but anywhere. I think that's very clear. And I think we should say out loud why. It's been much harder to figure out how to make money in adaptation. So one of the reasons that mitigation continues to be so robust is because carbon is being commodified, and we have trading schemes, and we have all kinds of investments, and you can get bonds and borrow money cheaply and all this kind of stuff. That's been a lot harder for adaptation. So I think we might have to confess that that we are going to need more state money and more public leadership on adaptation, because the money is likely to be in much higher percentage public. We are probably all going to have to contribute, in other words. And I think that kind of acknowledgement of the central and state role is really important. I love your question about global citizenship up on top. I think one of the great ways global citizenship is being encouraged among social scientists and natural scientists is by their students. I think actually it's been a great role in the last decade or so of students challenging faculty and others in university life to think more globally and to speak more globally, and revealing maybe their more colonial mindsets, their more old school ideas of power in society. So I think in general, just keep challenging the scientists to be more global is one good answer. But it is scientific communities are very unequally distributed in the world. So they continue to be very heavily dominated by North America and Europe. And so the challenge and the critique is really important, because numerically speaking, that's the world we live in terms of where they come from. Yeah, mining, we have the same problem in the States. It's been very difficult to get any going. And it is the case that it's extremely expensive, and it's partly because of environmental rules. That's right. But the China rule is really important, because the other thing, though, is that for a lot of commodities, the processing is so unequally in China that actually probably also there's a kind of monopolistic power, right? Is that it's very hard to be economically competitive if you're not in China in these kinds of things. So even if we cleared the decks of some of the environmental problems, it's not at all clear we get mines, because they probably require a big subsidy and other kinds of things because of the competitive environment. So I think this tells us we have to figure out how to work better with China on supply chain issues as well. But it's a huge challenge. There were a bunch of mining interests in the States a few years ago that convinced the government to give them a whole bunch of very large grants and loan guarantees, but they didn't build any mines in the end. They did take the money, but they didn't build any mines. And it's partly because it just was not at all clear that they could get them done for the reasons you mentioned, and the global competition just isn't clear.
Thank you. Mikael?
Yep. So I'll answer your question about representation and participation. I think that's super important. So the researchers on biological diversity have been quite good on this. And I think the researchers in climate politics, we're learning. So we're slowly getting there. But what's happened is that at the UNFCCC, there is now an Indigenous Peoples platform where they try to engage lots of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think researchers are now paying attention to that as well. So it's coming.
Thank you. Johanna?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the mining question there. And I think it's important here to remember that the environmental legislation is there for a reason. It's there because we also need to protect the biodiversity. We need to have, safe environment in terms of chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a reason why we have this environmental legislation. And many of the business representatives that I meet is actually not critical against the legislation as such, but with the implementation. And that the implementation in this case is, as you mentioned, that the process of getting a permit is really, really long, and perhaps too long. And I mean, there has been different proposals in Parliament about how to deal with this. And a lot boils down to perhaps more resources to the county administration boards, et cetera, so that there is people to deal with the application that is coming and they're coming from the company. So I think it's important here to distinguish between the legislation and the implementation of the legislation, and that such in the legislation that we have in Sweden is really, really important to deal with not only climate issues, but the other topics that we also need to solve at the same time. And you touched upon it in your lecture by the end there. I mean, finding these win-win solutions where we deal with the climate and the biodiversity, for example, at the same time.
But I think you also were previously involved in commissioning a report in SSNC about these licensing processes. And yet another factor was that many companies do not hand in what's required by the agency. So
exactly.
For that reason, we have these long delays as well.
It is a normal reason why the process is so slow and the permit, getting the permit takes a long time, is that the requirements are not met in the first place when the companies file their application.
Charles?
So all good questions. Adaptation, well, it's supposedly one of the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, finance. And along with finance, it's one that the international community is failing at. And I agree with Stacy, part of that is the money. Who pays? With mitigation, there's been a lot of attention this week, for example, on Uruguay, switching out to all renewables. That's because the companies can go in there and get paid for supplying electricity. Adaptation, which is a problem that's here now, it's probably more about transfers of finance. And that, of course, has proved difficult. And that's something that the rich countries need to get better at. Global citizenship, important. I think Negma did a great job of answering that question, Stacey as well. And I mean, UNFCCC and the COP summits, you see the importance of youth, young world citizens. And the UNGOs, they're present there, also protesting, that's important. In terms of representation, you mentioned biodiversity as a good sort of role model. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're trying to improve their record there, bringing in more scientists from the global south and more women. It was very global north and male dominated. If you look at their statistics, it's improving, but too slowly. So that's something to pay attention to, making sure that we have representation, both at the negotiation level, but also at the science level, and also listening to activist voices. The mining, I'll just say that, if we think about realizing how much of our energy systems were dependent upon Russian gas, and that is a good reason for, if we need any more reasons for getting off fossil fuel, but then people realize, well, if you look at the supply chain for green energy, a lot of that would be dependent on China. So we have to think about diversifying that and doing that, as you said, and it's still in an environmentally friendly way. We don't want to wave away environmental protection, but we need to do it in a way that allows Sweden, Europe, North America to get in the game. A lot of these rare earth metals are in these places, but it wasn't profitable to mine them. So how to make a win-win for the environment and energy security, that's something we all have to work on.
Thank you. And maybe if I just can add on, I mean, adaptation is suffering in a way, as Stacey said, from the same challenges as energy efficiency. It's much easier to sell mitigation measures or supply of energy than to talk about adaptation and make money out of that, or energy efficiency or energy savings. But I think another reason is that adaptation has not become an issue in the global north, because it's not until, I mean, the last 6 assessment report from IPCC that was really clear on extreme weather event, and we have had leapfrogging in terms of knowledge production in that field, and we're starting to see consequences also very near in the global north, which might spur the debate on adaptation. I can just say this landslide in the north of Gothenburg here on E6 was, what? Landslide? Many said, yes, but the governmental committee, the vulnerability committee in 2007, Sårbarhetsutredningen, already detailed that, I mean, 2007, and actually had the idea to dig a channel from Lake Vänern out to the Western Sea to avoid these types of problems from the river down to Göteborg. So we have been aware of these issues for a long time, but it's easy to sort of push them to the future unless you see the consequences near in place and time. So a few more questions. I want to look at this side of the room as well. And we have 3 up there, and we will manage the 3 if you're brief and if you're brief and you're responsible. So 1, 2, and 3. Yes, you can start.
Sorry to interrupt you.
What?
There's only one question on Zoom, but there's also one question on Zoom. Sorry to.
Yes, but there are so many hands in the. Yes, we can do. Okay. Yes.
Something of the previous event, both very important, also including environmental action or. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on sort of the type of activism, so and effectiveness. So is it there's large scale mobilization that goes all according to the rules of what the normal protest should look like, or more small scale disruptive actions like we've also seen in local places?
Okay, activism.
Right. But may I also
No,
say,
because then we won't have time for the responses. So you have raised the topic. Yes.
David Langley with the Law Department. Briefly, Stacey, you made a very elaborate description of what was seen for a long time as the natural trajectory for climate policy. I mean, starting with solid evidence that it's saliently communicated, and then adding empirical evidence of climate change happening and translating policy, and that didn't happen. In terms of sort of scientific research, what does it say about why did we believe this for such a long time? What are we not? Why did we see caveats there? And what are we not seeing now?
Thank you. And one row up. Yes.
Yeah, Claudia French, concerned citizen. So I'm interested in the local food perspective, which we haven't touched on. For many years, Sweden has been far ahead, 20 years ahead of the rest of Europe in recycling and energy production from waste and all of this. But now we see other countries, for example, in the United States and Britain, years ahead of Sweden in terms of local food resilience, in terms of what we're teaching our children about local food, and in terms of what the local authorities are doing about this. For example, Uppsala Kommun has nobody at all who works with local food issues. So I'm just wondering if the panel would like to comment on what can we in Sweden learn from other countries in terms of local food resilience and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. And since we promised to those following us on Zoom that they could also ask questions, we will actually take the only question on Zoom that we have.
So this is from Jens Ergon, who's a PhD student at Uppsala University, and he wonders if not the climate policy backlashes we see are interlinked with wider political trajectory and backlash, and the sort of backlash of neoliberal globalization.
Thank you. So we will reverse the order, I think, and let you close this. But Charles?
Yeah, I won't address all of this, but in terms of types of activism, I think we need more research on that. And actually, in my department, we have a woman by the name of Katrin Uva who's doing research on that, research into the activists and the impact of social protest movements. So not my area of specialty, but it seems to me that the mass protests oftentimes raise issues, whereas I think we need a little more attention on whether the disruptive actions are actually helping or hurting, what it does to the people who are affected. Because Stacy mentioned, to the extent that climate change motivates people to act, does it affect their everyday life? And if the activists are disrupting it, is that actually gaining allies or alienating? I don't know the answer to that. That to me is an interesting research question. In terms of the local food, I'm not a food expert, but I mean, I think it does illustrate the issue that there's a role for local action on climate, and climate change to me isn't one issue. It has it's every aspect of society, and food is part of that. And therefore, I think we could try to do a better job of learning from best practices from other places. So good for people like you to highlight some of these other areas. Sometimes we can get lost in mitigation and climate negotiations and forget about the fact that climate change goes all the way down to the local level. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you, Johanna.
I wanted to pick up on the activism question or comment there. And I'm too very interested in the research that you're looking for and want to address, because it's very interesting. But on a general level, I would say that plurality or I don't think you can say that this kind of organization or movement is the one, because I think it's so important that there are different arenas. One reason being that it's good that there are, in a way, different opinions and different level of radicalism in the environmental movement, but also that different people are attracted to different kinds of organizations. So it's good that there are different types that different people can get involved with. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Nagli?
Yeah, also make a comment on the activism just because it's so topical. So researchers' activism absolutely works, but then it's about the tactics. And so we've seen more disruptive forms of protests. And the sort of initial research that has come out is that it helps to raise the salience of the issue in the public debate, but then there could also risk causing this backlash. So it's like a tricky balancing line depending on sort of the tactics used, but definitely activism works.
Stacy.
Quickly, I'm going to connect activism and the food question, because I think actually I agree with what you said here about activism, and I would also just add that it depends on what you want, because one more local, and I don't mean that just in terms of cities, but in terms of our personal connections form of activism, is whenever you could. I loved your comparative thing. Sweden used to be ahead on some things, but behind on food, and Uppsala doesn't have anything. This, I think, is a good form of activism, because actually saying to a place like Uppsala, major global university, major city, place host, that actually lots of other towns are ahead of you on this important thing is a good form of activism. It is like needling them to act when, but it also allows you to demonstrate what you want, right? Is that what the progress you might want to make is not just theoretical, because you say, look, these are the towns, they have this, we don't. Right. And I think actually that's another really important form of activism. Why did we think this about science? I think actually it's a general bias of our university life. We're almost always in university and scientific life way overconfident about the role of evidence and reason in the world, because we tell ourselves all the time that's why we do things. Having just left my post as department head, I also questioned that assumption because it was a nightmare. But I think actually it is a bias of our very education-centered and research-centered lives, and other people don't live that way all the time. So it's worth reminding. And the last thing is, I do think actually we should be thinking more in our own research about backlashes, not just in terms of climate or environment, but I think the ways in which arguments against justice, arguments against gender equality, arguments against gender diversity, right? There are backlashes going around, and probably there are connections we should be thinking more clearly about there.
Thank you very much, Stacy, and thanks to the panel. And I know that many of you have raised hands and want to ask further questions or comment on this. And I have two answers to that. One is that we will have a mingle and an easy lunch meal here. And then if I can get this machine starting, there. We have also courses, of course, in climate change leadership, and two of them shorter, briefer courses coming up. Climate leadership in business, so you can bring your mining friends so we can discuss there. And one targeting policymakers and agencies from local to national level. We also have this MOOCs, and we have another course, etc. So you'll find more information on that website. So I hope to see you you there. I would like to thank the panel with some gifts. I was wondering, what is this? I've been kicking them a bit with my foot here. I thought the gifts were in the back room. When you open, you will laugh even more. This has to do with a person who actually worked at this university quite some years ago, who was instrumental for us to be able to talk about climate and temperature and so. Saying anything more about that, but taking those is perhaps not the best thing. So sorry for that. But I would like to thank you all for being here, and in particular, Stacy, that you have been giving this lecture, participating in this seminar, and I'm looking forward to continue to collaborate with you throughout this year. And thanks to all of you on Zoom and here in the room as well for being here. So let's give the panel